service and the antidote to much of that. Remember that your failure to be informed does not make me a wacko. Well, what is it we have learned this summer amidst all of the fighting that's been going on over politics? It's really funny to watch how the different channels handle what it is the candidates say and how they slant things in directions that they want, covering the very same story. Here's the first thing I've learned this summer. The reason politicians don't tell the American people the truth is because the American people don't want to hear the truth. If you look at the things about which we are debating as part of these presidential debates, a lot of it is nonsense. The truth is, by the time President Obama leaves office on January 20th, the national debt will reach $20 trillion. We've learned that this is the big item of our future because more fractures financially are on the way. We've learned that our two presidential candidates aren't talking about it. We've learned that the four biggest budget items, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense spending, are rising precipitously, and GDP is only growing just a scunch over 1% annualized. This is an impossible situation, and government refuses to get out of the way. That's the next thing we've learned. Politicians will not get out of the way and lower the taxes and lower the regulations to get the small businesses going, to get the jobs going, to get where we need to get going. The truth is, we are now on a train whose fate is a massive train wreck financially. This is the end game of all fiat currencies, and the politicians just can't bring themselves to tell the passengers. Remember, the end game of any currency, the options of the PTBs become more and more limited. And you notice that our Fed and our Fed chair, Janet Yellen, are both there right now, and so are other central banks around the world. Governments are overcommitted to either social or military spending, although social spending and socialism per se seems to take the bulk of the budget. There's little change in sight. The politicos insist on adopting programs like increasing taxation to try to deal with their problems, causing us more problems like fewer jobs. Recall that no nation in the history of the world has ever taxed itself into prosperity, which brings us to the next thing we have learned. Much of the ideology about economics that we have heard, nominally John Maynard Keynes since the 1930s, has proven to be false or toxic. You have to look. We've dumped incredible quantities of stimulus and quantitative easing into the system. The central banks are backing into negative interest. This is an historic first in the history of the world, by the way, and it looks like lots of helicopter drops of money are on the horizon. What's the next thing we've learned? Well, we've learned that all of the markers we used to use for reference points economically and now politically are moving. And so we're moving while observing the markers to try to figure out where we're moving, and they're moving as well. And everybody's trying to figure out what's moving where and how. It's what's called the new abnormal. After 2007, 2008, it was the new normal. Now it's the new abnormal. Look at the stock market. It's doing fabulously well, despite the fact that we just had a Brexit vote, which should have tanked it for quite some time. But it buckled for 3 days and then was back and bouncing as normal. The leading economic indicators are indicating real trouble right ahead, a recession by next year, but the market's still bubbling along. What else have we learned? Well, this won't surprise you, I'm sure, but our politicians aren't telling us the truth. The experts, the Federal Reserve, and the politicos are consistently wrong in their projections, and they're the ones making monetary and tax policy. Now, that's a nightmare. Maybe we need to get somebody new. Well, we're trying, but that doesn't seem to be working too well in this electoral process either. We have learned that there are only several ways historically off of a financial train wreck such as the one we are approaching. And we can look at it as several different jump-out doors. Door number one, severe austerity. You see, we had all of the benefit in the past. Now everybody today has to pay for all the benefits that everybody got in the past and still continues to collect today. Like that's really going to fly well at the election polls. We'd re-elect Adolf Hitler if it meant avoiding that. Door number two, destroy the currency. Of course, that means inflate it to death where it becomes valueless, cause much havoc, social unrest, violence, etc., just like Venezuela is going through right now. Well, guess what? That's not going to fly very well in the media either, and people will elect anyone who promises you we don't have to do that. Door number three, national bankruptcy, where the government simply reneges on the promises it made to everybody. Oh, yeah, watch what happens when beneficiaries don't get Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, veterans, Social Security. That's going to go over really well at the polls, too, not to mention the streets. Milwaukee would just be a dress rehearsal for the big event. And there's the ever-popular door number 4. Start a war with someone on the pretext that they start the war with you. What else have we learned? Well, from Black Lives Matter in Milwaukee, we've learned that toxic false narratives have toxic, dangerous, deadly results. For 50 years, we have been preached a toxic gospel of helpless, hopeless, and blameless. Helpless because they're there because of white prejudice. Hopeless, well, they can't do anything about it, so therefore they can demand things from the system to help them. And blameless. Any actions they take are justified because they're not responsible for the situation. We've also learned, by the way, that the narrative that we're going to fight racism and intolerance and prejudice has only gotten us more intolerance and prejudice. What's the next thing that we have learned? Well, most of this toxic narrative has been kept going by lots of howling on the part of people who want to keep it going. As soon as you violate one little corner of the toxic narrative, so out of all of this, what have we learned so far? And the events of the summer have delightfully shown us some of the things that we need to do for the future. Number 1, we need to move on from the howling. That involves not listening to the howlers. Number 2, when someone howls at you and calls you a racist or a blank or whatever, your answer is, yeah, right, that's not going to fly anymore. Do you have anything intelligent to contribute to the conversation? If not, we're not listening. Number 3, start talking about how we as an American people are divided. This is something the howlers created for their own benefit. Remember, the idea was to merge everybody to an equal standard, which is number 4, all of the double, multiple, triple, inverted, reversing, contradictory, and sometimes relativistic standards have got to quit. Number 5, let's show everybody here we're approaching some really big problems as a country. And the ones the howlers have created to try to divert us and create division, those aren't the real problems. The real problem is how all of us, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and all of the other groups can live and work together and hold together in the rough times that are ahead that the howlers have put us in and that the politicos won't admit. We're at SteelOnSteel.com. I'm John Lufter. The program is Steel on Steel. I always remember since I was in seminary studying to be a Catholic priest right at the early part of the 1970s, that's when the PJs cut loose right about that time. The PJs are the Peace and Justice groups. And I remember that there were a lot of priests, nuns, and brothers that were falling all over themselves to embrace all of these new ideas, which looked strange at the time because they were rehashes of old ideas. And Francis Schaeffer warned us. He said, remember that the church always latches on to what it considers to be new last, just before society is ready to move on to the next stage. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lufter here with you. For a long time, we've been hearing terms like sustainable development, and it gets put in everything. If you write a grant, you have to splatter these buzzwords around to get the attention of the people who might be giving you the grant money. Sustainable development. Of course, that was a term that's very, very difficult to define, but everybody uses it. The other one that has come along with the PJs, that's being sloshed around right now, is social justice. This is one of these terms. Don't you care about people? Don't you believe we should have social justice? Because it's not fair that fill in the blank, whatever it is here. But remember Lefter's 4 rules. Whenever somebody says something, especially a politician, you have to ask 4 questions. Number 1, what does that mean? Number 2, how will it be implemented or enforced? Number 3, is it voluntary or mandatory? And be careful of the word voluntary. And the best one is number 4, who is going to pay for it? So let's ask those questions from someone who has just written an article in that area. Pat Wood is back with us right now, who founded the August Corporation in 1975. He's editor of the August Forecast and the August Review. He wrote the book Trilaterals Over Washington with the now late Anthony Sutton. Very good book. That was back in the, late 1970s, wasn't it, Pat?
That's correct, yeah.
And also author of his latest book, 2015, Technocracy Rising. It doesn't say that on the cover, but I thought I'd throw that in there. The Trojan horse of global transformation.
That's called emotional radio.
Is that what that is?
That is.
I just call it entertainment.
That's good too.
I mean, this word is just flying by us every single day. You wrote an article on it. So when we talk about social justice, why don't you lay the groundwork? First of all, where did this term ever come from? Let's trace this one on back.
Oh, yeah, boy, this is interesting. I didn't realize this fully myself. Maybe I knew it one time and I forget it. I forget a lot of stuff, I guess. But the first attribution of the term was by a Jesuit priest, of all things. Back in the 1840s, his name was Luigi Tapparelli. Now, I'd never heard of him. I don't think he hit the history books.
He was Irish, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, that's right, an Irish Jesuit. And he wrote about it back then. He didn't call for the government to force the issue of transfer of wealth, but he argued that working for the common good was the highest calling that man had. That wasn't a new idea either, by the way, but Tapparelli used the term, actually, social justice. He put the term together. And, you know, the idea is kind of this holism idea where everything is part of a greater unit above them. And so people are part of a neighborhood is part of a suburb is part of a city is part of a county, and so on. And the idea of working for the common good is to lay aside self and do everything for the good of everybody. And this has some oblique root in the Bible, by the way, where we're told that, you know, we should pick up our cross daily and follow Christ, and that we should deny self. But those are voluntary terms in the Bible. It's not like, well, here, now, John, I'm going to make sure you deny yourself. I'm just going to take everything away from you that you might like and want. I don't, you know, when I start to do it, that's wrong. If you do it, it's your business. You can do what you want. If you want to go on a diet and don't eat food, do that. But I have no right to come and tell you, John, we're cutting your ration back by 50%. So there, take it and like it. But at the same time in the 1840s, Karl Marx started to write about social justice. And much in the same context. I don't have any evidence that Tapparelli knew Karl Marx. He could have, because they were contemporaries. But Karl Marx brought up basically the same thing, and of course equated it to the government's responsibility, the people's responsibility to rise up against the 1%. And the bottom line in the whole thing is, in my view, is in simplest terms, it's taking from one group and giving to another group arbitrarily and by force. Even though they may say it's voluntary, it still is by force. That means if Group A has too much money, Group B comes along and says, you have too much stuff, we don't, we want you to give us some of your stuff. And Group A says, you know where to take a hike. And Group B says, that's not fair. Now the conflict begins. And eventually, since Group A is not willing to give up what Group B wants, eventually it ends up in a physical conflict. Invariably, it does. This is historically exactly what's happened. And so there's different types of inequality that you can look at. There's income inequality, where people say the rich are too rich, the poor are too poor, we need to balance it out, give, you know, take from the rich, give from the poor. It's a Robin Hood concept. Last time I checked, by the way, Robin Hood was still violating the Ten Commandments because it says, thou shalt not steal. But that's another issue, I guess. So taking from one group, giving to another. But you have other areas too, like in terms of respect. You've got some people have tremendous esteem and respect in the community. Other groups will say, it's not fair that you have so much respect and everybody disrespects me. So we're going to take from you, we're going to tear you down to make us look better. This is kind of the heartbeat of political correctness. It's tearing down another group that has esteem or respect for the sake of elevating another group. Now, there's other examples that I could give. I think probably this taking from one group and giving to another. You see it play out in many things, in politics, political powers. One group has too much political power, another group doesn't. That's not fair. You know, we want some of your political power, or we're going to take it if you don't give it to us. Lots of different ways this expresses itself. The United Nations is really big on income inequality, by the way. But here you had, in the case, from the 1840s going forward, Karl Marx, the Catholic Church, through this Jesuit priest, and eventually those two parallel tracks touched in the early 1970s, probably before that a little bit, to create what we now know as liberation theology.
Could I jump in here for just a sec, Pat?
Absolutely.
When we talk about, say, for example, healthcare is a right, access to clean water is a right. We keep hearing about these rights. Now, these are what are called positive rights compared to our Declaration of Independence, which were negative rights. They were limitations on government. The problem with that, when you say that,